So we're going to continue on taking a look at more things to do with JavaScript. Now that we kind of have a good understanding of events and the DOM and just basic syntax, we can really start utilizing that to stack some more things on, right? So some of these next couple chapters are going to be a little bit smaller because what we're going to do is just basically keep layering some items into it. So in chapter 7, we're going to take a work with some links, some images, and some timers in order to, once again, make our page a little bit more dynamic. So going back to just kind of how we've done before, the applied objectives is to use JavaScript to cancel out the default action. So that'd be like a link itself has a default action. Well, but what if we cancel that out and we do something else? How to preload images so that our pages will load faster. Use a one-time and interval timers with JavaScript applications. We'll talk about some cross-browser compatible functions. Describe why we want to preload, especially for like image swaps and slideshows, and then take a look at some timer methods like set timeout, clear timeout, set interval, and clear interval. So when we talk about default events, right? So here are some HTML stuff that have default events, right? An anchor tag has a default event. A button inside of our form has a default event. So what we can utilize is we can use JavaScript to remove that event and then have it do something else. So as we begin working with that, one of the things that we'll talk about is how to cancel a default action. And there's a little bit of code here that talks about using older Internet Explorer. I'm not even really too concerned about that. We're going to kind of focus in on here. So if you notice, we have a variable called event handler that is a function that brings in the parameter of EVT. And what EVT is a built-in element. And then we can say e.prevent default. And so what that's going to do is that's going to prevent the default of that thing happening. So don't worry about worrying about the older IE code and stuff like that. What we have to worry about is sometimes cross-browser compatibility, right? So this, here we see the same thing in where we're like if not EVT, right? We can go through here, that's for IE. Then this stuff is for most other browsers and then also for IE, right? So I know that might not make a lot of sense right off the bat. A lot of like just to kill a default action is just copy and pasting this code and kind of taking a look at it. And we're gonna see some examples of that as we go through. One of the other things that we'll talk about is preloading images. So here we're creating an image object, right? Var image equals new image, it's creating an object. And then what we can do is we can set its source code to an image. And what this does is allows us to preload the image before it actually shows up on the page. And so the server goes out and gets that image and starts like building it to kind of cut down on time. So if we want to preload all images that we're going to use here, one thing we can do is we can basically just go through that array, right? And we can start sucking in those images for those different items. So here you see we have an array called links, which is going to get all the anchor tags. And then from there, it's got a variable called I, link, and image. I is our loop variable. Links is the array, so it's going to cycle through that. Link is going to be equal to link sub I, right? So that's back to the array. Image is equal to new image. Image source is equal to link.href, right? So here's our link and then the href. So if it's dog.jpg or whatever the case may be, we're going to suck that off one at a time and make it work a certain way. So what that allows us to do is use that application for like a swap application. So here, when we click on the images, it's going to swap down below. Now, this goes back to turning off that default action. If these images are anchor tags, and this one was going to the big one .jpg, when I would click on this, it would open up in a new page. But that's not what we want. We want when we click on this that it changes the property of this one down below. So I don't know if I have a example of this one, but we'll go take a look. Here's a swap. So example files. Let's go take a look here. See what this one does. So you notice when we click on it, right, it swaps the images as we go through. Okay, so just kind of think about that. Think about what's going on here as we kind of go through here. Now, if we look at the HTML code, we notice that they're just image tags, right? Image tags within, well, actually this is an ahref, and then it goes to the thumbnail and so on. If we look at the swap.js, right, here's where we create the list node, the caption node, and the image node. So we're grabbing all that information here. Right here is where we're canceling out that that whole chunk, right? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut this out here a second, and I might have cut too much out. Let's see. Where's this guy end? So that is part of that. Oh, so you notice that here it's pulling the EVT as well. So what I would have to do is I'm going to comment out this line, this line. We still want to grab that other piece, although it's not going to do anything, right? So let's see what this happens when we launch this page then. Right, so that's what an anchor that's what a link to an image is supposed to do, right? So by putting this code in here, right? So basically it's going to go through every which one that I click on. It uses the this command. And then based off of whichever one I clicked on, it's going to say if it has an EVT to basically prevent that default from happening. Once again, what I'm going to tell you is this function, this piece here, here, and then down in here, you just put that in and kind of tweak it for yours, right? So we have the $sign to set up the get element by ID. We get all our nodes. We go through and do that stuff. So if you look at what happens, we create a list node of the image list, a caption node of the caption, the image node. And then basically here we're going through it, we're switching the image source by getting the href of the link. We're also then getting the caption node and changing that based off the title. So if we go back here, you notice that here's the href, that's what's going to switch it. Here is the title, and that's what becomes our caption, right? So when we come out here, that's the title becoming the caption. Where this is going, right, you can see it down below, right? You can see down below there where I'm going to deer.jpg. That's what's telling it to swap here. So it's a real simple swap. Nope, that's a different one. So like I said, it's a real simple process. You have your thumbnails and then you have your images, right? So we have those different things. So we're showing the thumbnail, but then we're linking to the main image. And so that's how we can go about doing this. So that's one way that we default it out and we take it out. And then here you just see that same code that we just looked at with the style sheets to make them all work in line. Here's the swap.js file that has taken place. So once again, having an understanding of the DOM makes a good idea. The other thing that we can do is we can use some functions that work with a timer. So there's the set timeout and clear timeout. This creates a timer, that cancels the timer, right? So if we look at this one right here, it says the FAQ application with an upgrade that starts after 5 seconds, right? So we already looked at the DOM of how this goes. We have this item here, and what it's going to do is in 5 seconds, it'll start showing it, right? So we're creating this timer, and so it's a variable just called timer. And then it comes down here, when we cancel the upgrade, we clear out the timer, right? There's nothing inside of it, we're clearing it out. Otherwise, when it loads, timer is equal to set timeout, start upgrade of 5 seconds, right? So 5,000 milliseconds. So what that's going to do is in 5 seconds, it's going to call this function right here. And so that's what we're doing here. And then so if we hit the cancel, then it goes on and moves on throughout there. So it's a real simple way for us to bring things in. I don't think I have that. Pretty sure I don't have that as a example. It's just a real simple thing to look at and everything. So the other thing that we can put in there is the set intervals. So an interval will call, if you notice, like when we did this set timer, the set time, timeout and clear timeout, that's a delay, right? So we're going to wait a certain time and then we're going to call a function. With the set interval, we're going to set a time that every so many seconds or whatever the case may be, then it's going to keep recalling the function. And I have a really good example of this that's not part of this book. It's one that I've used in the past, but here where it says tutorial. So if we go and we launch this clock, it's going to go through and every second it's recalling the function that goes and gets the time, right? So it's just keeping it moving as we go through. And if we look here, what's happening is when the page loads, right, on load, it calls that function and New Year's clock every second, which so every second it goes back up here and goes through this whole process. It gets the current date, goes through, breaks it down, everything else. We have an example of also over here where we have a slideshow. And so if we look at the .js file here, it's very, very similar to what we had before, but here we have the set interval. So the set interval is going to call the function, and then from there, it's going to happen every 2 seconds. Now, you see how this is written here? I'm not a big fan of doing it this way. This is kind of how the book did it. I would rather call this function a name and then set it inside of here. So, right, just the name with the time. But here, right, this is going here. So, right, the first part of that is the function. The second part's the time. So if we run this program, it's going to go through and it just goes to the next slide as it kind of goes throughout. So we also have the ability to clear that timer out as well. So we could, one of the slides that I have here shows you a very similar thing using the FAQ application. Here's the number of seconds on the page. So it's just basically keeping a counter as it goes through there. So here's an example of the set interval method on that page, right? We have the counter. It just keeps updating the counter every second, and then I can cancel the timer once I hit clear interval. So this one is another one using an anonymous function, right? So here, once again, we're just keeping a counter every second, nothing too major. So we already took a look at that slideshow. I do have a couple other examples in here too. So we have some solutions. So this is a rollover. This rollover one. Right, so I roll over and it does it. Now we did this back when we first started doing style sheets, that we actually changed the background property of like a paragraph, right? This is actually changing the image itself. So if we look at what's happening here, right, here's our image. If we look at the style sheet, we're grabbing that image 1, image 2, making our list. And then here it's just getting the new image. So on mouse over, which is an event, it calls this function and switches the source. On mouse out, it switches the source back. So that's all we're using is a mouse over, and everything else. There's no style sheet that's going into this or anything else that goes with that. Here's another example of the slideshow. So now you notice the other one just started. This one I can start by itself. It's going to go through the process. I can also pause it and restart it, right? And so then it goes to the next slide. So if we look at the JS file here, we have a thing called run slideshow, right? So that's a variable which has this whole function inside of it. On load, it gets all the information, right? Once we click start, it calls run slideshow. It sets a timer where then it continues to call run slideshow every 2 seconds. So what it's going to do is that's where it's going to switch its image. You notice then that we can disable the start button and then remove the attribute of disabled from the pause, which makes it go back. Once we click the pause button, right, it clears the interval. It clears this piece right here. It makes the start button, removes that attribute, and then puts that other attribute back. So those are just some of the things that we can do with that as you go through it. So that really wraps up Chapter 7. It's a kind of a short one. You have a couple assignments that go with it that utilize both these timers and everything, and you have some great examples here, and you should be on your way.